Hey guys, Lego King 99 here. Today I'm going to be talking about a comic series I recently got into and why it's probably the best current running comic series I have read. I'm talking about Nick Anderson's Planet Ripple series. Nick Anderson, also known as Nick on Planet Ripple on YouTube, Nick Anderson is also known as Nick on Planet Ripple on YouTube, where you can also find his video series Lego Rewind. Very funny and insightful series where he talks about retired LEGO themes, but I'm here to talk about his comic series. In recent times, most comics have gotten pretty political. I usually don't mind this if it serves the story, but from what I used to read of modern Marvel and DC comics, they've gotten so political, mostly left-leaning, and in-your-face about pointless PSA-style messages that it's just boring and annoying. Something similar happened in the 70s, and that was my least favorite era for DC Comics for that very reason. This is the main reason I don't read much in the way of modern comics and mostly stick to DC and Marvel that was made before the late 90s and early 2000s. Planet Ripple has some messages in it, but they're done in a much better and much more natural way that doesn't bring the story to a halt. For example, this scene here, where Minnow told Noma that people in her childhood told her she should never breed due to her autism. To me, the exchange that happens is pretty realistic for somebody who would value life like Noma and the rest of the mer people, appear to in the story. It only lasts for a couple of panels, and better yet, it actually contributes to the story because it brings up Minnow's amnesia. She appears to have partial amnesia, which is a type of amnesia you don't see in fiction often. Usually it's just total amnesia, because I think they don't want to try anything too complex, but here it's implied she can remember some of her childhood and her name, but not a whole lot besides that. The story itself is pretty neat because it's set in a universe you don't often see done right. The Earth is flooded due to an unknown cause, although in an interview you'll find on Nick's YouTube channel, he says it's going to come up in a future volume and has something to do with the moon. Pretty much all land on Earth is gone, and in the story the first bit of land that has shown up so far is conquered by the Barracuda Gang, the main villains of the series. I'll get to them later. Humanity now lives in a series of huge ships, like the Bellina, where most of our story took place, which are more or less these futuristic cruise ship type ships, kind of ship/submarine kind of areas built by the military. There are some pretty neat features to them, like a series of little pods on top with huge greenhouses in which they grow their food and open up whenever they surface to give plants some actual sunshine to help them grow. So the picture there. Let's see. Let's see. Yeah, here it is. Yeah, they got these little pods open up and they're growing stuff like corn and looks like tomatoes and stuff like that. So, yeah. This is an interesting concept because I could see something like this being built in the event of a disaster of this sort in real life. You can tell they were likely designed in advance, so like a couple of years before the flood, to save humanity before the flood struck full force. And they seem fairly realistic as far as sci-fi ships go. They're kind of basic and utilitarian, as you'd expect for something designed mostly for survival, and are kind of like these giant apartment buildings built by the Navy. It kind of gives off this cyberpunk idea where these huge corporations rule the world now. Because at one point they mentioned this company called Cura Industries and this blueprint type splash page displaying some neat facts about Minnow's limbs, implying that there are a lot of different cyborgs in the universe. That's Maybe I should kind of rehearse these. That was here it is. Yeah. See, they're designed to detach from the body to easily, to easily replace and repair. And they've even got this kind of interesting idea for if they get rejected and they have infections. It's kind of cool. You'll have to see that page to get all the details, but it's pretty cool. Speaking of Minnow, let's get into the characters. Minnow, our main character, is an autistic girl who, according to a line in the comic, was born without arms or legs due to a birth defect. It was shown in a flashback she was rescued by the former captain of the Ballina, Andrea, who saw her in the middle of a storm, out cold on the backs of a couple of dolphins with a chunk of metal stuck in her side. She then brought Minnow in and treated her like a daughter until a salvage incident about 7 years before the story takes place led to Andrea having sacrificed herself to save Minnow's life, leaving Minnow only an adorable giraffe plushie and her pet seal puppy to remember her by. And already we get an awesome backstory to our main character. Her amnesia leaves most of her past a mystery to us, and the fact she has never known a sense of touch due to robotic limbs makes you feel sympathy for her. Also, the portrayal of her autism here is very accurate to some types of the disorder. It isn't like in most movies where the autistic character is either this comic relief goon or an antisocial genius with usually no middle ground. And she isn't a boring Mary Sue with no conflicts like you usually see with female characters today. Look at you, Rey from The Force Awakens. Minnow is usually pretty smart, but has a hard time with other things. Like one point in the story where she mentions she doesn't understand the difference between patted on the back to be congratulated or being grabbed by the shoulder when she's being yelled at or criticized. Her life's pretty miserable at the start, and I kind of felt like I wanted to give her a hug at times, especially when she's picked on by the crew and breaks down after Christina Marks, that jerk, yells at her and says she wished she had died, and says she wished Minnow had died instead of Andrea. It reminded me a little of that scene in Lord of the Rings Return of the King when Denethor tells Faramir he wished Boromir had died instead of him. Minnow goes through a lot of pain in the first volume. When Denethor tells Faramir that he wishes Boromir had died instead of Faramir had died instead of Boromir. Ugh, I get confused. Reminded me a lot of that scene. Minnow goes through a lot of pain in the first volume, but she does get happier and stronger as the volume goes on, and I can't wait to see what Volume 2 has to offer for her character. Next character I'd like to talk about is Noma, one of the Mer people. It's mentioned they're a separate race of humanoids that has always been on Earth, which I find a little more interesting than the overused mutated humans or token aliens angle you usually find in stories like this. They apparently have been hiding underwater for centuries, just seen in fleeting glimpses from ships that inspired the legend of the mermaids, and I love this angle. When you think about it, if you describe someone as being half fish after, say, a sailor fell off a boat, was rescued, and talked about seeing a half fish, half woman being rescuing him, of course they picture something goofy like a creature with a woman's torso and a fish tail. Noma's very sweet and compassionate to Minnow, and her brother, Nulk, is apparently friends with the current captain of the Ballina, Nathaniel Rudd, who became captain after Andrea died. Noma also bonds with Minnow at one point after mentioning she was also rescued by Andrea when she was young, and shares Minnow's sorrow at losing her, which I find to be a very sweet little scene. The current captain of the Ballina, Nathaniel Rudd, is also a cyborg like Minnow, with a mechanical eyeball replacing his left eye. To me, he kind of looked like Captain Picard from Star Trek, but with a little more hair. He appears to be a pretty nice guy, although I personally kind of question his effectiveness as captain since Minnow's medical needs were overlooked for so long under his command. He isn't as well liked by the crew as Andrea was, which is part of the reason Minnow was picked on so much early on in the story, and I find this kind of interesting. The whole political climate being what it is today, some people tend to get picked on because of their affiliations on one political side or the other. I can kind of see something similar to that with Minnow getting picked on because the crew didn't like the new captain, and to them, reason was that Minnow Andrea died. As for Christina Marks, God, I hated her. She reminded me of my old English teacher in college who treated the class like we were a bunch of losers. Right from Christina's first appearance in the comic, you can tell the kind of character she is and you want to toss her out a porthole for it. She kept Minnow in terrible conditions despite the fact she is mentally and physically disabled, constantly allowed her nephew Kelsey to pick on her, and even outright bullied and humiliated Minnow at least twice in the story. The only real saving grace is the fact she does care about Kelsey because she is the only family Kelsey has, which shows she is at least compassionate to her nephew. And I kind of hope she gets killed off in a future volume myself. Speaking of Kelsey, he is a pretty interesting character. He was apparently good friends with Andrea before she died and is kind of quick to assume the worst of people. He starts out as a bully who picks on Minnow a few times and even tosses a giraffe plushie in the toilet at one point as a cruel prank. But after being screamed at by Minnow, he notices exactly how upset she is and tries to make it up to her. The beginning of the story actually saves her life after she suffers kidney failure and fixes up the giraffe for her. He even kind of becomes friends with her later on after he explains that he was angry at losing Andrea, he was a good friend, and how the crew pretty much only picked on her because they didn't like Nathaniel Rudd as the new captain. Kelsey even protected Minnow after he was caught by the Barracuda gang, only giving one of their soldiers, Hack, the most basic of information about her, although technically that didn't help either, making him one of my favorite secondary characters in the series so far. Let's see. And that brings us to the main villains. These guys are pretty cool. In a post-flood Earth, you'd imagine that there are some of those who would rather prey on the disadvantaged instead of getting with the new way of the world. And these guys do a pretty decent job of displaying that without looking like the stereotypical pirates that you'd see in stories like this. Nolk even outright states it when he says, "These pirates are no mere men with peg legs and cutlasses." The main villains are a band of pirates calling themselves the Barracuda Gang, named after their leader, the pirate queen Barracuda. They're pretty much all cyborgs with various kinds of cybernetic implants and prosthetics due to injuries. And they wear this cool armor that makes them kind of look like the Toa from Bionicle mixed with the bounty hunters from the Metroid games. And given that the author is a big fan of both Lego and Metroid, that makes sense. The gang is mostly out to conquer the newly emerging land and steal things like vitae, a substance that is very useful for cyborgs, and as near as I can tell, either use it for themselves or probably sell on the black market for a little extra money. There's some pretty cool ships that are built to look kind of like sea creatures, something I always liked in fiction, like Atlantis, the Lost Empire, how they had the what's it, the Leviathan, it kind of looked like a giant lobster, or Aqua Zone, where they had looked like sharks, lobsters, and other kinds of creatures. It's implied that Barracuda is kind of an ableist because Hack, one of the higher-ranking pirates, says she prefers to surround herself with uninjured people who have very few, if any, cybernetic implants / prosthetics. She also keeps this kind of cool tank full of super piranhas. That's these piranhas about the size of anglerfish, and the skeletons of people who annoyed her. Full of the skeletons of people who annoyed her. I can't really talk. Which I find to be both macabre and comical due to the goofy signs they were wearing that say things like, "I sat on the Queen's hat and crushed it," and "I delivered a shipment of the Queen's favorite toffee and kept some for myself" on them, implying that she has no mercy for even her own people. Hack, who is more or less her second in command, is pretty badass. He reminds me of Karapar from Bionicle, meets one of the pirates from Metroid, mostly because of his armor and the giant claw attachment on his left arm. He's not as augmented as the other pirates, with only some of his ribs and all the bones in his in his left arm being mechanically enhanced, earning him a higher rank than most others because Barracuda likes that about him. Mostly enhanced because so that Whiplash doesn't break his arm every time he uses a claw. He's pretty much the only pirate who's been successfully able to land a blow on Minnow so far, and apparently has some kind of connection to her, seeing as he recognized her after he cut up the mech loader she was successfully using to attack the rest of the pirates, like Ellen Ripley from Aliens. He's a pretty neat three-dimensional villain, and I'm kind of curious to see how he progresses in the future. So yeah. Where was I? There isn't a whole lot to say about what is it? There isn't a whole lot to say about Honora Hakes because she hasn't really, because she hasn't done a whole lot in Volume 1. Let's see. Although she did give Minnow some new limbs that are more watertight and are less, and has less weight to them, because at one point she mentioned that her arm was kind of pulling on her, that it was too heavy, messed up her shoulders. But I'm curious to see what she has next in Volume 2. She seems pretty nice, but it's hard to say. She ended up recruiting Minnow for this kind of neat program where she says that she wanted somebody to test out this mech suit that she had designed to fight against the pirates. After some discussion, Minnow agrees to leave and gets these new limbs, and there's this really cute bit here where she has the new cuffs and stuff replaced with arms. This cute bit here where she talks to Lear. She looks at them and she actually cries. It's adorable because during the story, the limbs were so mismatched, and the limbs were these mismatched hand-me-downs that kind of caused her a lot of pain. One pulled on her shoulder so much it messed up her shoulder, and it's implied that she was kind of off balance because of the different shapes of her feet. If you read the comic, you'll understand what I mean, because they go a little more in detail there. But there, she's so happy to find that her limbs actually move, she actually cries. It's adorable. Yeah. Overall, aside from slightly small text size and a couple of roughly drawn panel borders, which Nick says he was going to fix in some future volumes, this comic is pretty awesome. I've only read Volume 1, and I'm already excited to see what happens next. It's really rare for a comic to do that to me these days, and I'm looking forward to reading Volume 2 at some point in the future. If you'd like to see a positive portrayal of an autistic character done right, or even if you're not autistic but just love sci-fi comics in general, give this a read and support an independent artist series. This is Lord of the Lego, signing off.